Most people believe they know why they're unhappy. They point to their job, their bank account, their relationships, their past, or their uncertain future. They say, if only I earned more, if only I had more time, if only things went my way, then I'd finally feel at peace. It sounds logical. It feels true. But what if the real reason behind your unhappiness has nothing to do with your actual problems? What if most of the weight you carry every day isn't coming from reality at all, but from the stories your mind keeps telling you? The Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." At first glance, this sounds like a poetic phrase, something philosophical and distant from everyday life. But if you pay close attention to your thoughts for just one day, you'll start to see how accurate those words really are. From the moment you wake up, your mind begins projecting possibilities. You check your phone and see a message from your boss, and instantly your thoughts jump to conclusions. Did I do something wrong? Am I in trouble? What if I get fired? Nothing has actually happened yet. It's just a message. But your heart rate increases. Your mood drops. If you feel tension in your chest, a small neutral event has turned into a full-blown emotional reaction, all because of a story your mind created in seconds. Later in the day, you think about your finances. You imagine unexpected expenses, rising prices, or losing your source of income. You picture yourself struggling, unable to pay bills, falling behind, and losing control. None of this is happening right now. In this moment, you may be sitting safely in your room, but your body reacts as if those threats are real. Your energy drops. Your focus disappears. You feel tired before the day has even begun. Then come the social worries. You replay past conversations in your head. Why did I say that? They must think I'm stupid. You imagine future interactions. What if I embarrass myself? What if they reject me? What if I fail? Again, nothing is actually happening. These are just mental movies. But the emotional cost is real. By the end of the day, you feel drained. You tell yourself life is exhausting. You say the world is stressful, people are difficult, and the future is uncertain. And while some of those things may be true, you rarely notice how much of your exhaustion comes from things that never happened. Think about this carefully. How many of your fears from the past actually came true? How many nights did you lose sleep worrying about events that never occurred? How many times did you imagine the worst possible outcome, only to discover later that things turned out fine, or at least manageable? The human mind has a powerful ability to imagine danger. This ability once helped our ancestors survive. Thousands of years ago, anticipating threats meant the difference between life and death. If you heard a rustle in the bushes, it was safer to assume it was a predator than the wind. But the modern world is different. Most of the threats we face today are not immediate or physical. They are social, financial, or psychological. And yet, our brains still react as if every imagined scenario is a life or death situation. This creates a strange paradox. The same mind that allows us to plan, create, and dream also becomes the source of our suffering. It constructs problems that don't exist yet. It exaggerates risks. It replays past mistakes like a broken record. It predicts disasters with absolute confidence, even though it has been wrong countless times before. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every day, but instead of being filled with real objects, it's filled with imaginary bricks. Each brick represents a worry about something that hasn't happened. One brick is fear of losing your job. Another is fear of what people think about you. Another is fear of the future. Another is regret about the past. None of these bricks exist in physical reality, but the weight feels real. And because you carry this backpack everywhere, you begin to believe life itself is heavy. Now imagine putting that backpack down, even for a moment. The world wouldn't change instantly. Your job would still be the same. Your finances might still be uncertain. Your relationships would still have their challenges. But something inside you would feel lighter, not because your problems disappeared, but because the imagined weight disappeared. This is the core idea the Stoics tried to teach. They didn't claim that life was easy. They didn't say suffering didn't exist. They simply pointed out that much of our suffering comes from our interpretation of events, not the events themselves. Two people can experience the exact same situation and feel completely different about it. One person loses their job and thinks, "My life is over. I'll never recover from this." Another person loses their job and thinks, "This is difficult, but maybe it's an opportunity to find something better." The external event is the same, but the internal response changes everything. This doesn't mean the second person is pretending everything is fine. It means they are not adding extra suffering on top of an already difficult situation. They are dealing with reality as it is, instead of combining reality with imagination. And this is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves. They don't just experience a problem, they multiply it with thoughts. A small mistake at work becomes, "I'm terrible at my job." A rejection becomes, "No one will ever respect me." A delay becomes, "Nothing ever works out for me." Each thought adds another layer of emotional weight. Over time, these thoughts become habits. The brain gets used to expecting the worst. It becomes skilled at predicting failure, embarrassment, and loss. It starts to feel normal, and when something neutral happens, the brain automatically turns it into something negative. This constant mental negativity doesn't just affect your mood, it affects your decisions. When you expect things to go wrong, you start avoiding opportunities. You don't apply for the job because you imagine rejection. You don't start the project because you imagine failure. You don't talk to the person because you imagine embarrassment. You don't invest in yourself because you imagine it won't pay off. In this way, imagined problems begin to shape real outcomes, not because they were true, but because you acted as if they were. You closed doors before you even reached them. You gave up before the challenge began. You chose safety over growth, fear over possibility. This is how imagination can quietly drain your life. It drains your energy because you're constantly worried. It drains your time because you overthink instead of act. And it even drains your bank account, because fear-based decisions rarely lead to growth or opportunity. Think of all the chances people miss because of imagined fears. The business idea they never start, the skill they never learn, the investment they never make, the opportunity they never pursue. Over time, those missed chances add up, not just emotionally, but financially. And yet from the outside it looks like life simply didn't give them a break. It looks like bad luck. But inside, the real cause was something else, a mind that kept predicting disaster. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that while we cannot control everything that happens in the world, we do have some control over how we interpret it. And that small area of control can make a massive difference in the quality of our lives. If you remove imagined suffering, many problems become smaller, not easy, not pleasant, but manageable. A difficult conversation becomes just a conversation. A mistake becomes just a lesson. An uncertain future becomes just a series of possibilities. Reality by itself is often less dramatic than the stories we tell about it. So the question isn't just, why am I unhappy? The deeper question is, how much of my unhappiness is coming from things that haven't even happened? If you start observing your thoughts, you may discover something surprising. Much of your stress isn't caused by real events. It's caused by anticipation. Much of your sadness isn't caused by reality. It's caused by interpretation. And much of your exhaustion isn't caused by your life. It's caused by the endless stream of imagined problems your mind keeps producing. And once you see that clearly, a new possibility opens up. Because if imagination can create suffering, it can also stop creating it. To understand why imagined suffering feels so real, you have to understand how the human mind works. Your brain is not designed to make you happy. It is designed to keep you alive. And for most of human history, survival depended on one critical skill: anticipating danger before it arrived. Imagine living thousands of years ago in a world without walls, without police, without supermarkets, without modern medicine. Every day was uncertain. Food was not guaranteed. Shelter was fragile. Predators, illness, and rival tribes were constant threats. In that kind of environment, the people who survived were not the most relaxed or optimistic ones. They were the ones who were alert, cautious, and often suspicious. If someone heard a strange noise in the bushes and assumed it was nothing, they might not live long enough to learn from that mistake. But if someone assumed the worst, if they imagined a predator and reacted quickly, they had a better chance of surviving. Over time, the human brain evolved to favor this kind of thinking. It became highly skilled at imagining danger, even when danger wasn't certain. This survival instinct is still active today. The problem is that the world has changed, but our mental wiring has not. Most of us are not running from predators or fighting for food. Our threats are different. They are deadlines, social expectations, financial worries, and future uncertainties. But the brain treats these imagined threats with the same urgency it once reserved for wild animals. When you imagine losing your job, your brain doesn't calmly say, "This is just a thought." It reacts as if the threat is real. Stress hormones are released, your heart rate increases, your body prepares for danger, and the more you think about it, the stronger the reaction becomes. This is why imagined problems feel just as heavy as real ones. The body doesn't distinguish between an actual threat and a vividly imagined one. If you think about an embarrassing moment from your past, your face might flush, your stomach might tighten, and your mood might drop. Even though the event is over, your body relives it as if it's happening again. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology existed. They didn't have brain scans or scientific studies, but they observed human behavior carefully. They noticed how people created unnecessary suffering through their thoughts. One of the central Stoic ideas was simple but powerful. It is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about those events. This idea was most clearly expressed by the Stoic philosopher Epic. He taught that external events are neutral. They only gain emotional power through the meaning we attach to them. For example, imagine two people stuck in heavy traffic. One person becomes furious. They slam the steering wheel, curse the drivers around them, and feel their stress rising. The other person accepts the situation. They turn on some music, listen to a podcast, or simply sit quietly. Both are in the exact same traffic jam, but one is suffering, and the other is not. The difference is not the event, it is the interpretation. The same pattern appears everywhere in life. A criticism can feel like an attack on your worth, or it can feel like useful feedback. A failure can feel like the end of your journey, or it can feel like a lesson. A delay can feel like a disaster, or it can feel like a minor inconvenience. The Stoics believed that most people hand over their emotional well-being to external events. They let circumstances decide how they feel. If things go well, they feel good. If things go badly, they feel miserable. In this way, their peace of mind is always at the mercy of forces they cannot control. But the Stoics proposed a different approach. They divided the world into two categories: things you can control and things you cannot. Your thoughts, your actions, your judgments, these are within your control. Other people's opinions, the economy, the weather, the past, the future, these are not. Unhappiness, according to the Stoics, often comes from focusing too much on what you cannot control, and not enough on what you can. Think about how much time people spend worrying about the future. They worry about what might happen next week, next year, or in 10 years. They imagine losing money, losing relationships, losing status, losing security. But none of these things are happening right now. They are simply possibilities. And yet, these possibilities dominate their thoughts. They lose sleep over them. They feel anxious, distracted, and overwhelmed, all because of events that may never occur. This is exactly what Seneca meant when he said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." He observed how people constantly projected themselves into the future, inventing problems before they existed. In one of his letters, Seneca described how people waste their lives worrying about what is to come. They live as if the worst is guaranteed. They prepare themselves emotionally for disasters that never arrive, and in doing so, they end up experiencing those disasters mentally, even though they never happen in real life. It's like watching a horror movie over and over again. Even though you know it's fictional, each time you watch it, your heart races, your muscles tense, and your fear feels real. But the threat is only on the screen. In the same way, your mind plays out imaginary disasters, and your body reacts as if they're real. Another Stoic, Marcus Aurelius, who was also a Roman emperor, faced real dangers every day. He dealt with wars, political betrayal, disease, and the constant pressure of ruling an empire, and yet, in his private writings, he repeatedly reminded himself of a simple truth. Most of the things we fear are not happening right now. He wrote about how the present moment is usually manageable. The pain comes from adding thoughts about the past and the future, regret about what has already happened, fear about what might happen next. But the present moment, by itself, is often much simpler than we imagine. Think about your current moment, right now, as you listen or read. Are you in immediate danger? Are you starving? Are you being chased? For most people, the answer is no, and yet, their minds are filled with worry. They are stressed about tomorrow, next month, or next year. This doesn't mean their concerns are completely irrational. Life does contain real risks and challenges. The Stoics never denied that, but they believed there was a difference between preparing for the future and mentally suffering through it before it arrives. Preparation is calm, rational, and focused. It involves planning, saving money, learning skills, and taking action. But imagined suffering is different. It is repetitive, emotional, and unproductive. It drains your energy without improving your situation. Imagine two people worried about their finances. One person spends their time constantly thinking, what if I go broke? What if everything falls apart? They feel anxious, but they take no real action. The other person also recognizes the risk, but instead of worrying endlessly, they create a budget, learn new skills, and look for opportunities to increase their income. Both are aware of the same potential problem, but one suffers in imagination, while the other acts in reality. The Stoics encouraged people to move from imagination to action. Instead of asking, what terrible thing might happen, they asked, what can I do right now? This shift in thinking is powerful because it brings you back to the present moment, the only place where action is possible. You cannot act in the past, and you cannot act in the future. You can only act now. When you stay in the present, most problems become smaller. That become specific tasks, instead of overwhelming disasters. Instead of thinking, my life is falling apart, you think, I need to send this email, or I need to save a little more money, or I need to have this conversation. The problem becomes concrete and manageable. But when you live in imagination, problems become abstract and endless. There is no clear action to take, just a cloud of worry hanging over your mind. This is why the Stoics placed so much importance on mental discipline. They believed that peace of mind wasn't found by changing the world, but by changing how you think about the world. If you could learn to question your thoughts, to separate reality from imagination, you could reduce a huge amount of unnecessary suffering. They practiced this daily. They reminded themselves that many of their fears were just thoughts, not facts. They trained themselves to focus on what they could control. And over time, this created a deep sense of inner stability because when you stop treating every imagined problem as reality, something remarkable happens. Your mind becomes quieter, your energy returns, your decisions become clearer, and life, even with its challenges, starts to feel more manageable, not because the world changed, but because your relationship with your thoughts did. If imagined suffering is such a major source of unhappiness, the next question becomes obvious. Why does the mind do this in the first place? Why does it keep creating problems that don't exist yet? Why does it replay painful memories and predict negative outcomes so automatically? The answer lies deep within the way the brain is wired. Your mind is not an objective, neutral machine. It is a survival tool, shaped by millions of years of evolution, and one of its strongest tendencies is something psychologists call the negativity bias. The negativity bias is the brain's natural tendency to focus more on threats, problems, and negative experiences than on neutral or positive ones. From a survival standpoint, this made perfect sense. Missing one positive opportunity might cost you a meal, but missing one real threat could cost you your life. So the brain learned to prioritize danger above everything else. This is why a single negative comment can ruin your entire day, even if you received 10 compliments before it. It's why you can remember an embarrassing moment from years ago with perfect clarity, while you struggle to recall dozens of ordinary or pleasant moments. The brain holds onto negative experiences because it believes They contain important lessons for survival, but in the modern world this bias often works against us. Instead of helping us survive, it keeps us trapped in cycles of worry, regret, and fear. Consider how the mind reacts to uncertainty. When the future is unclear, the brain doesn't naturally imagine the best possible outcome. It usually jumps straight to the worst one. If your boss asks to speak with you, your mind may immediately think, "I'm in trouble." If a friend doesn't reply to your message, you might think, "They're upset with me." If you make a small mistake, you might think, "This is going to ruin everything." These thoughts feel automatic. They appear without invitation, and because they appear so quickly, they often feel true. This is where the brain's threat detection system comes into play. Deep inside your brain is a structure called the amygdala. Its job is to scan for danger. When it detects something that might be a threat, it sends signals throughout your body, preparing you to react. This system is extremely fast. It operates before your rational mind has time to evaluate the situation. That's why you can feel anxious or stressed before you even know why. Your brain has already labeled something as a potential threat, even if it's just a thought. The problem is that the amygdala cannot distinguish between real and imagined danger. If you picture yourself failing an exam, losing your job, or being rejected, the emotional reaction can be similar to what you'd feel in an actual crisis. Your body tenses, your breathing changes, stress hormones are released. This creates a feedback loop. The more you imagine negative outcomes, the more your body reacts, and the more your body reacts, the more real those imagined threats feel. Soon, your thoughts and your physical sensations reinforce each other, making the imagined danger seem undeniable. Over time, this loop can become a habit. The brain starts to expect negative outcomes because it has practiced imagining them so often. Just like any other skill, the more you do it, the better you become at it. If you constantly rehearse fear, your brain becomes an expert at producing it. Think of the brain as a path through a field. The first time you walk across the grass, there is no clear trail. But if you walk the same path every day, the grass flattens. Eventually, a visible trail appears. The more you use that path, the more defined it becomes. Negative thinking works the same way. Each time you imagine the worst, you reinforce that mental path. After a while, your brain doesn't even consider other possibilities. It automatically takes the familiar route, the one that leads to worry and fear. This is why some people seem naturally anxious, while others appear more calm. It's not always about their external circumstances. Often, it's about the mental habits they've developed over time. But here's the important part. Just as negative thinking can become a habit, so can calm, rational thinking. The brain is flexible. It changes based on what you repeatedly do. This ability is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself. If you constantly practice worry, your brain becomes better at worrying. But if you practice questioning your fears, focusing on reality, and thinking calmly, your brain can learn those patterns too. This is exactly what the Stoics were doing. Even though they didn't have a scientific term for it, they were training their minds. They were building new mental paths, ones that led to clarity instead of panic, action instead of worry, and acceptance instead of resistance. They understood that the first thought that appears in your mind is not always under your control, but the second thought often is. For example, imagine you make a mistake at work. Your first thought might be, "This is terrible. I'm going to get fired." That reaction may appear automatic, but the Stoics would say the important part comes next. Do you accept that thought as truth, or do you question it? A trained mind might respond differently. It might say, "Yes, I made a mistake, but mistakes happen. Let me see what I can do to fix it." The external event is the same. The first emotional reaction may even be the same, but the second thought changes everything. Instead of turning a small problem into a catastrophe, the trained mind keeps it in perspective. Another psychological factor that fuels imagined suffering is something called catastrophic thinking. This is the tendency to assume that a small negative event will lead to the worst possible outcome. For example, you make a small mistake at work. You think your boss will notice. Then, you imagine getting fired. Then you imagine not finding another job. Then you imagine losing your home. Then, You imagine your entire life falling apart. All of this that happened in a matter of seconds, inside your mind. A small, manageable mistake turns into a life-ending disaster, at least in your imagination. The Stoics recognized this pattern. They noticed how quickly the mind escalates problems, and they developed practices to counter it. One of those practices was called premeditation malorum, or the premeditation of evils. At first, this might sound like more negative thinking, but it was actually the opposite. Instead of vaguely fearing the future, the Stoics would calmly imagine a specific worst-case scenario, and then think through how they would handle it. For example, a Stoic might think, what if I lose my job? Instead of panicking, they would continue the thought, I would reduce my expenses. I would look for new work. I would rely on my skills and my discipline. I have survived difficulties before. I can survive this too. By thinking it through calmly, the imagined disaster loses its emotional power. It becomes a problem with possible solutions, not an undefined cloud of fear. Modern psychology has a similar concept. When people face their fears rationally instead of avoiding them, the fears often lose their intensity. The unknown is always more frightening than the known. When you shine a light on your worries, many of them shrink. Another reason imagined suffering is so powerful is because the brain prefers certainty even if that certainty is negative. The unknown feels uncomfortable, so the mind often fills in the gaps with worst-case scenarios, simply because it wants a clear answer. For example, if you don't know how someone feels about you, your brain might assume they dislike you, not because it's true, but because uncertainty feels worse than a definite conclusion. The Stoics trained themselves to accept uncertainty. They understood that the future is never fully in our control. Instead of trying to predict every possible outcome, they focused on building inner strength. They believed that if you develop discipline, wisdom, and resilience, you can handle whatever comes. This mindset changes the role of imagination. Instead of using it to create fear, you use it to prepare yourself mentally. Instead of asking, what if everything goes wrong? You ask, if something goes wrong, how will I respond? This shift moves you from helplessness to capability, from anxiety to readiness. When you truly understand this, something inside you starts to relax. You realize that many of your fears are just mental habits. They are not prophecies. They are not guarantees. They are simply patterns your brain has learned over time, and just as they were learned, they can be unlearned. You don't have to believe every thought that appears in your mind. You don't have to follow every path your brain offers. You can pause. You can question. You can choose a different response. Don't. That simple act, questioning your thoughts, can break the cycle of imagined suffering. Because once you see a thought for what it really is, just a thought, it loses much of its power over you. Most people think of worry as something emotional. They see it as stress, anxiety, or mental exhaustion. But very few people realize that imagined suffering doesn't just affect how you feel. It also affects how you live. It shapes your decisions, your habits, your risks, your opportunities, and ultimately, your financial future. In other words, the fears in your mind are not just draining your energy. They are quietly draining your bank account too. This doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly, over time, through small decisions driven by imagined problems. Each decision seems harmless on its own, but when repeated over months and years, they create a life shaped more by fear than by potential. Think about how fear influences your choices. Imagine someone who constantly worries about financial instability. They picture themselves losing everything. They imagine worst-case scenarios over and over again. As a result, they become extremely cautious. They avoid any opportunity that feels uncertain when a chance to learn a new skill appears. They think, what if I waste my time? When an opportunity to change careers appears, they think, what if it doesn't work out? When they consider starting a side business, they think, what if I fail and lose money? So they stay exactly where they are. They choose the familiar over the uncertain, even if the familiar is limiting. They remain in a job they dislike, with income that barely grows, because the imagined risk of change feels worse than the real cost of staying stuck. Years pass. Their income stays the same. Their skills don't expand. Opportunities pass them by. And from the outside it looks like they simply didn't have good luck. But in reality, something else was happening. Their imagined fears were quietly shaping every major decision. This is one of the hidden costs of worry: opportunity loss. You rarely notice it because it's invisible. You can see the money you lose in a bad investment. You can see the cost of a mistake. But you cannot easily see the cost of opportunities you never took. Imagine two people starting in the same situation. They have similar skills, similar resources, and similar opportunities. The first person is guided mostly by fear. Before every decision, they imagine the worst possible outcome. They picture failure, embarrassment, loss, and regret. So they choose the safest option each time. They avoid risks. They stay in comfortable routines. They rarely step outside their comfort zone. The second person also feels fear, but instead of letting it control their actions, they question it. They ask themselves, is this fear based on reality or just imagination? If the risk is reasonable, they move forward anyway. They apply for the job. They learn the new skill. They start the small project. They take calculated chances. 10 years later, their lives look completely different. The first person has stability but little growth. Their income has barely increased. Their skills are outdated. They feel stuck, but the thought of change still scares them. The second person has more experience, more skills, and more opportunities. Some of their risks failed, but others succeeded, and those successes opened new doors, leading to better income, better confidence, and a wider range of choices. From the outside, it might look like the second person was simply more talented or more fortunate, but often, the real difference was psychological. One person allowed imagined suffering to control their decisions. The other did not. The Stoics understood this principle in their own way. They didn't speak in terms of modern careers or investments, but they constantly warned against letting fear dictate your actions. They believed that the greatest losses in life were not always material. Often they were losses of character, courage, and opportunity. Fear, when based on imagination rather than reality, leads to hesitation, and hesitation repeated over time becomes stagnation. Another financial cost of imagined suffering comes from impulsive decisions driven by anxiety. When people are constantly worried, they often seek short-term comfort instead of long-term growth. For example, someone stressed about money might constantly think, what if I don't have enough? What if something goes wrong? Instead of making a clear financial plan, they might cope emotionally. They might overspend on things that bring temporary relief: entertainment, luxury items, or habits that numb their anxiety. In this case, the imagined fear of the future creates poor decisions in the present. The stress leads to actions that actually worsen the financial situation, confirming the original fear. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. There is also the cost of distraction. When your mind is full of imagined problems, your focus disappears. You can't think clearly. You struggle to concentrate. You procrastinate, not because you're lazy, but because your mental energy is being consumed by worries. This reduced focus affects your performance. You make more mistakes. You miss details. You struggle to complete tasks. Over time, this affects your reputation, your promotions, and your income potential. So the cost of imagined suffering is not just emotional exhaustion. It is lost productivity, missed opportunities, poor decisions, and long-term stagnation. Seneca once wrote about how people behave as if money is the most valuable thing in life, yet they waste time and energy constantly worrying. He pointed out that time and attention are far more valuable resources. Once they are gone, they cannot be recovered. When your mind is trapped in imagined fears, you are spending your most precious resources: your time, your focus, and your energy in problems that don't even exist yet. It's like paying rent for a house you don't live in. And just as financial interest accumulates over time, emotional interest does too. Each day of unnecessary worry adds a little more exhaustion. Each fearful decision closes a few more doors. Each missed opportunity reduces your future options. Years later, the results become visible. People wonder why their lives feel small, why their finances feel tight, why their dreams never materialized. They often blame external circumstances, and sometimes those circumstances are genuinely difficult. But in many cases, the real cause was quieter and more subtle. It was the constant habit of imagining the worst, and then making decisions as if those imagined disasters were guaranteed. The Stoics encouraged a different mindset. They believed in preparing for the future, but not suffering through it in advance. They advised people to act with reason, not fear, to make decisions based on what is true, not on what is imagined. They understood that fear will always be part of life. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the ability to act despite it. When you stop letting imagined problems control your decisions, something powerful begins to happen. You start noticing opportunities you once ignored. You begin taking small, calculated risks. You invest in skills, in relationships, in experiences that once felt too uncertain. And over time, these small decisions create real change. Not because the world became easier, but because you stopped letting imaginary fears limit your actions. In this way, the Stoic insight becomes practical, not just philosophical. When you reduce imagined suffering, you don't just feel calmer, you become more effective. You make clearer decisions. You take better opportunities. And slowly, both your life and your finances begin to reflect that shift. Because the greatest cost of imagined problems is not the stress they create in your mind. It is the life they quietly prevent you from building. One of the most damaging effects of imagined suffering is not the stress it creates, but the doors it quietly closes. Fear rarely announces itself as a life-changing force. It doesn't always look dramatic. Most of the time, it appears as hesitation, doubt, or a simple decision to wait a little longer. But over time, these small moments of hesitation shape the entire direction of a person's life. Opportunities are strange things. They rarely arrive with perfect conditions. They often appear uncertain, inconvenient, or even intimidating. They ask you to step into the unknown, and the unknown is exactly where imagined fears thrive. When your mind constantly predicts negative outcomes, every opportunity starts to look like a risk. Every possibility begins to feel like a threat, and when everything feels dangerous, the safest choice always seems to be doing nothing. Imagine someone who has always wanted to start their own business. They have an idea, they've done some research, they know there's a chance it could work, but the moment they consider taking the first step, their mind fills with imagined disasters. What if I fail? What if people laugh at me? What if I lose money? What if I'm not good enough? None of these things have happened. They are just thoughts. But those thoughts feel real enough to stop action. So instead of starting, they wait. They tell themselves they need more time, more money, more confidence, more certainty. Months turn into years. The idea remains in their head, but never in the real world. Eventually someone else launches a similar idea and succeeds. Now the regret is real, not imagined. This is the quiet tragedy of imagined suffering. It doesn't just create stress. It prevents growth. It replaces action with hesitation, and possibility with regret. The Stoics believed that life is defined by how we respond to what is presented to us. Every situation contains a potential action, a chance to show courage, discipline, or wisdom. But imagined fears distort that situation. They make the action seem impossible, dangerous, or pointless. Instead of seeing an opportunity, you see a threat. Instead of seeing a challenge, you see a disaster. And so, you step back. This pattern appears in almost every area of life and careers. People stay in roles that no longer serve them because they imagine that change will be worse. They picture rejection, failure, or instability. So they choose the discomfort they know over the uncertainty they fear. Years later, they feel stuck. But the thought of leaving still feels too risky in relationships. People avoid honest conversations because they imagine conflict or rejection. They keep their feelings hidden. They tolerate situations that don't fulfill them. They tell themselves it's safer to stay silent. But over time, the relationship weakens anyway. The thing they feared often happens, not because they faced it, but because they avoided it. In personal growth, people delay learning new skills or pursuing passions because they imagine embarrassment or failure. They think, I'm too old, or I'll never be good at this, or what if I look foolish? So they never start. And the only guarantee is that they never improve. What's interesting is that imagined suffering doesn't just stop big decisions. It also affects small, everyday actions. Someone might hesitate to speak up in a meeting because they imagine sounding stupid. They might avoid introducing themselves to someone new because they imagine rejection. They might skip applying for a better job because they imagine being unqualified. Each of these decisions seems small, but life is built from small decisions. And when fear guides most of them, the overall direction becomes limited. The Stoics emphasized the importance of action aligned with reason. They believed that once you determine the right thing to do, you should do it without being paralyzed by fear of the outcome. The outcome, after all, is never fully in your control, but your action is. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to focus on the task in front of him, not on the possible consequences. He believed that worrying about outcomes only weakened your ability to act well in the present. This idea is powerful because it removes the weight of imagined futures. Instead of asking, "What if this goes wrong?" you ask, "What is the right action right now?" The focus shifts from fear to responsibility. Consider someone who wants to change careers. If they focus on imagined outcomes, their mind fills with questions. What if I fail? What if I earn less? What if I regret it? Each question creates more hesitation, but if they adopt a Stoic perspective, the question becomes different. Given my situation, what is the most reasonable step I can take right now? Maybe the answer is to learn a new skill, update a resume, or apply for one position. Not to leap blindly into the unknown, but to move forward in a rational, controlled way. This approach transforms opportunities. They no longer appear as huge, terrifying leaps. They become small, manageable steps. Another way imagined suffering destroys opportunities is by eroding confidence. When you constantly imagine negative outcomes, you begin to see yourself as someone who is likely to fail. Your self-image becomes shaped by fear. You start thinking, "I'm not the kind of person who succeeds," or "things never work out for me." These thoughts become beliefs, and beliefs influence behavior. If you believe you are likely to fail, you won't try as hard, you won't take as many chances, you won't persist when things get difficult, and as a result, you may actually fail more often, not because the belief was true, but because it shaped your actions. This is how imagined suffering can become self-fulfilling. You imagine failure, you act cautiously or not at all, opportunities pass, and then you say, "See, I knew it wouldn't work." The Stoics tried to break this cycle by focusing on character rather than outcomes. They didn't measure success by whether something worked out perfectly. They measured it by whether they acted with courage, wisdom, and discipline. From this perspective, taking a reasonable risk and failing was not a tragedy. It was an honorable action, but avoiding action because of imagined fear was a greater loss. Seneca wrote about how many people wait for the perfect moment to act, only to realize that life has passed them by. They were always preparing, always hesitating, always imagining better conditions in the future, but the future never arrived in the form they expected. Opportunities rarely come when you feel completely ready. Confidence often comes after action, not before it. But imagined fears reverse this order. They make you believe you must feel confident first, and only then take action. So you wait, and wait, and wait. Meanwhile, time moves forward. Every year you delay something important, the cost increases. The skill you could have learned 5 years ago would be far more valuable today. The business you could have started earlier would have had more time to grow. The relationships you could have built would be deeper now. Time amplifies both action and inaction, and imagined suffering often pushes people toward inaction. But the opposite is also true. When you start acting despite fear, opportunities begin to multiply. Each small step leads to new experiences. Each experience leads to new skills. Each skill opens new doors. And over time your life expands instead of shrinking. The Stoics believed that courage was not about heroic acts in battle. It was about daily decisions. The decision to speak honestly, the decision to try something new, the decision to accept uncertainty and move forward anyway, because at the end of life, most people do not regret the things they tried and failed at. They regret the things they never tried at all. And when you look closely, many of those missed chances were not blocked by reality. They were blocked by imagination. Philosophy often sounds abstract until you see it lived out in real lives. The Stoics were not just thinkers who wrote about calmness and courage. Many of them lived through extreme hardship, political danger, exile, illness, and loss. Their ideas were not created in comfortable classrooms. They were forged in difficult circumstances, where imagined suffering could easily become overwhelming. And yet, again and again, these philosophers demonstrated the same principle. The greatest source of suffering was not always the situation itself, but the way people thought about it. Take the life of Epictetus, one of the most influential Stoic teachers. He was not born into comfort or privilege. He was born a slave in the Roman Empire. His master was known to be cruel. According to some accounts, Epictetus even suffered a permanent injury to his leg because of that cruelty. Imagine the kind of thoughts that could arise in such a situation: bitterness, anger, self-pity, despair. It sensed that life was unfair and hopeless. Most people would consider those reactions completely justified. But Epictetus chose a different path. Instead of focusing on what had been done to him, he focused on what he still controlled. He realized that although his body was owned by another person, his mind was not. His thoughts, his judgments, and his responses were still his own. This realization became the foundation of his philosophy. He taught that external events, no matter how harsh, could not truly harm a person's character unless they allowed it. What mattered was not what happened to you, but how you interpreted it. Epictetus could have spent his life imagining all the injustices done to him. He could have replayed those memories endlessly, feeding his anger and resentment. But he understood something deeper. He knew that those imagined replays would only prolong his suffering. So instead, he trained his mind to focus on what was within his control. Eventually, he was freed. He became a respected teacher, and his words would influence generations, including emperors. His life is a powerful example of this truth. Even in the harshest realities, imagined suffering can multiply pain, while disciplined thinking can reduce it. Another powerful example comes from the life of Seneca. Unlike Epictetus, Seneca was born into wealth and privilege. He became a famous writer, philosopher, and political advisor. For a time, he was one of the most powerful men in Rome, but his life was far from stable. At one point, he was falsely accused of wrongdoing and exiled to a remote island. He lost his position, his influence, and his comfortable life in Rome. For many people, this would have felt like a complete downfall. Imagine the thoughts that might arise in such a situation. My life is ruined. Everything I built is gone. This is unbearable. These kinds of imagined conclusions could easily turn exile into a mental prison. But Seneca approached it differently. Instead of imagining the worst, he focused on what he still had. He still had his mind. He still had time. He still had the ability to read, write, and reflect. In exile, he continued studying philosophy. He wrote letters and essays. He used the time as an opportunity for reflection rather than as a reason for despair. Years later, he was invited back to Rome. He regained his position and influence. But even after returning, he often reminded himself of how easily circumstances could change. He practiced imagining the loss of his wealth and status, not to depress himself, but to free himself from fear. By mentally preparing for loss, he reduced its emotional power. He understood that much of people's suffering came not from the loss itself, but from the fear of losing. Then there is Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most famous Stoic of all. Unlike Epictetus, he was not a slave. Unlike Seneca, he was not just an advisor. He was the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world at the time. From the outside, it might seem like Marcus Aurelius had everything: power, wealth, respect, and authority. But his life was filled with challenges. His reign was marked by constant wars, political conspiracies, natural disasters, and a devastating plague that swept through the empire. He also faced personal losses. Several of his children died at a young age, something that was tragically common in ancient times. Each loss could have broken his spirit. Each event could have filled his mind with grief and fear. But Marcus Aurelius turned inward. He wrote a series of personal reflections, now known as meditations. These were not meant for publication. They were private notes to himself, reminders of Stoic principles. In these writings, you can see how he struggled with the same mental battles that people face today. He reminded himself not to be carried away by fear of the future, not to dwell on the past, not to imagine disasters before they arrived. He often wrote about the importance of focusing on the present moment. He told himself that the present task was enough, that worrying about the future only weakened his ability to act wisely now. Imagine being responsible for an entire empire, with enemies at the borders, disease spreading through your cities, and political plots forming around you. It would be easy to imagine endless disasters, but Marcus Aurelius kept returning to the same idea. Deal with what is in front of you. Do not suffer through imagined futures. These stories show a common pattern. The Stoics did not avoid difficulty. They faced it directly, but they refused to add unnecessary suffering through their thoughts. They understood that life already contains enough real challenges. There is no need to multiply them with imagined ones. There are also smaller, less dramatic examples from Stoic writings, stories of ordinary people facing everyday struggles. One story tells of a man who lost his ship and all his cargo in a storm. Everything he owned was gone. When he reached the shore, someone asked how he felt. The man replied calmly, "I have lost my cargo, but not myself." This simple response reflects a deep Stoic idea. External losses, while painful, do not define your inner character. As long as you still have your reason, your values, and your ability to act wisely, you have not lost what truly matters. Another story speaks of a philosopher who was mocked and insulted in public. Instead of reacting with anger, he simply walked away. When asked why he didn't respond, he said, "If someone offers you a gift and you refuse it, to whom does the gift belong?" The point was simple. Insults only hurt if you accept them. The suffering comes not from the words themselves, but from the meaning you attach to them. These stories illustrate the same central lesson. The Stoics did not deny reality. They did not pretend that loss, illness, or hardship were pleasant, but they believed that the mind had the power to reduce unnecessary suffering. They trained themselves to see events as they were, without adding layers of imagined fear, regret, or anger. This training gave them a kind of inner freedom. Epictetus found it even as a slave. Seneca found it in exile. Marcus Aurelius found it on the battlefield and in the palace. Their lives were different. Their circumstances were different, but their philosophy was the same. They understood that while you cannot always control what happens to you, you can often control the story you tell yourself about it. And that story can either trap you in imagined suffering or set you free from it. The stories of the Stoics are powerful, but they took place in a world very different from ours. There were no office jobs, no social media, no emails, number credit cards, no performance reviews, and no digital notifications interrupting every hour of the day. And yet, despite the differences in technology and lifestyle, the human mind has not changed much at all. The same patterns that caused suffering thousands of years ago are still present today. The difference is that modern life gives those patterns more opportunities to grow. We now live in a world where comparison is constant, information is endless, and uncertainty is always visible. The mind has more material than ever to imagine problems. And just like in the past, much of our unhappiness comes not from reality itself, but from the stories we build around it. Consider the modern workplace. Many people spend a large part of their lives at jobs that leave them feeling drained, unfulfilled, or underpaid. On the surface, it seems obvious why they're unhappy. Their job is stressful, the hours are long, the pay isn't enough. But if you look deeper, you often find another layer: imagined fear. Someone may want to change careers, but their mind fills with worst-case scenarios. What if I can't find another job? What if I earn less? What if I fail and embarrass myself? These thoughts feel so real that they stop any attempt at change. So the person stays where they are, not because they truly want to, but because the imagined risks of leaving feel worse than the real discomfort of staying. Every day, they feel frustrated. Every year, they feel more stuck. And from the outside, it looks like life simply trapped them, but often, the trap was built from imagined fears. Another common example appears in finances. Many people constantly worry about money. They imagine losing their income, falling behind on bills, or never achieving financial stability. These fears may have some basis in reality, but the way the mind handles them often makes the situation worse. Instead of creating a clear financial plan, the person becomes overwhelmed. They avoid looking at their accounts because it makes them anxious. They delay important decisions, or they seek comfort in spending, buying things that provide temporary relief from stress. In this case, imagined financial disaster leads to behaviors that create real financial problems. The fear becomes self-fulfilling, not because it was inevitable, but because it shaped the person's actions. Relationships provide another powerful example. Many people carry invisible fears into their interactions with others. They imagine being rejected, misunderstood, or abandoned. Because of these fears, they hold back their true thoughts and feelings. They avoid difficult conversations. They don't express appreciation. They don't set boundaries. They pretend everything is fine, even when it isn't. All because they imagine that honesty will lead to conflict or rejection. Over time, the relationship becomes distant or strained. Communication weakens. Resentment grows. And eventually the very outcome they feared begins to appear. Once again, the suffering was not caused only by reality. It was shaped by imagined outcomes that influenced behavior. Social media has added another layer to this problem. People now compare their lives to carefully edited snapshots of others. They see success, beauty, travel, wealth, and happiness displayed constantly on their screens. And without realizing it, they start imagining stories. They're ahead of me. I'm falling behind. My life isn't good enough. But these comparisons are based on incomplete information. Social media rarely shows the full picture. It shows highlights, not struggles. But the mind fills in the gaps, often in negative ways. Someone might scroll through photos of friends on vacation and think, everyone else is enjoying life except me. They imagine that others are happier, more successful, and more fulfilled. This imagined comparison creates real dissatisfaction, even if their own life is stable and comfortable. The Stoics faced comparison too, though in different forms. They saw others gaining wealth, power, and status, but they trained themselves to focus on what truly mattered: character, virtue, and inner peace. On the modern world, this lesson is more important than ever, because if you constantly compare your reality to imagined versions of other people's lives, you will always feel like you are losing. Another modern example is the fear of judgment. Many people avoid taking action because they imagine what others will think. They don't start a business because they imagine people laughing at them. They don't share their ideas because they imagine criticism. They don't pursue creative projects because they imagine failure in front of an audience. But in reality, most people are too busy with their own lives to pay that much attention. The imagined audience is often far harsher than the real one. A person might spend years wanting to start a YouTube channel, write a book, or launch a project, but each time they consider it, their mind creates a story. No one will care. People will judge me. I'll look foolish. So they delay. They wait for the perfect time, when they feel more confident. But confidence rarely appears before action. It usually appears after repeated attempts. So the waiting continues, and the opportunity quietly fades. Health is another area where imagined suffering plays a role. Some people constantly worry about their health, even when there is no immediate problem. They imagine worst-case scenarios from small symptoms. They spend hours searching for answers online, reading about rare diseases and extreme outcomes. This constant worry creates stress, and stress itself affects the body. Sleep becomes harder. Energy drops. The imagined health problem begins to create real physical effects. Once again, the mind creates a problem, and the body follows. Even in everyday situations, imagined suffering appears. Someone might send a message and not receive a reply right away. Their mind immediately starts creating stories. Did I say something wrong? Are they ignoring me? Are they upset with me? Minutes or hours of anxiety follow, all because of a simple delay. Later, the person replies casually as if nothing happened. The imagined drama existed only in the mind. These examples show how the Stoic insight still applies today. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. Not always, but often. The modern world gives the mind endless material for worry: economic uncertainty, social comparison, global news, personal goals, and constant communication all create opportunities for imagined problems. But the solution remains the same as it was 2,000 years ago. Focus on what is real, not what is imagined. Focus on what you can do, not on what might go wrong. Focus on the present moment, not on endless future scenarios. When you look closely at your life, you may notice that many of your worries are not about what is happening right now. They are about what might happen. And when you bring your attention back to the present, many of those worries lose their intensity. The job may still be stressful. The finances may still require attention. The relationship may still need work. But the overwhelming cloud of imagined disasters begins to clear, and what remains are real, specific situations you can actually do something about. This is the difference between living in imagination and living in reality. In imagination, problems are endless, vague, and overwhelming. In reality, problems are usually specific, temporary, and manageable. And once you begin to see that difference, you start to reclaim something that imagined suffering has been stealing from you all along: your sense of control, your clarity, and your ability to act. Understanding the problem is important, but understanding alone is not enough. You can read about imagined suffering, agree with the ideas, and still find yourself trapped in the same patterns of worry and fear. The mind does not change just because it learns a concept. It changes through practice. The Stoics were not just philosophers, they were mental trainers. They treated the mind the same way an athlete treats the body. They believed that calmness, courage, and clarity were skills that could be developed through daily exercises. If imagined suffering is a habit, then it can be replaced by new habits. And the Stoics developed practical techniques to do exactly that. One of the most powerful techniques is the simple act of separating reality from imagination. Whenever you feel overwhelmed, ask yourself a direct question: what is actually happening right now? Not what might happen tomorrow, not what could happen next month, not what you fear might occur, just what is happening in this exact moment. Often the answer is surprisingly simple. You might realize that you are just sitting at your desk, or walking down the street, or lying in your bed. The immediate moment is often neutral. The stress comes from thoughts about the future or regrets about the past. By returning your attention to the present, you remove the layers of imagined suffering. You deal with what is real, not with endless possibilities. Another Stoic practice involves questioning your thoughts. The Stoics believe that not every thought deserves your trust. Just because a thought appears in your mind does not mean it is true. When a fearful thought arises, instead of accepting it immediately, pause and examine it. Ask yourself, is this a fact, or is this just a story I'm telling myself? For example, if you think, I'm going to fail, ask yourself what evidence you actually have. Often you will realize that the thought is based on assumptions, not reality. It is a prediction, not a certainty. This simple questioning creates space between you and your thoughts. It prevents the mind from running automatically toward fear. Another powerful Stoic exercise is voluntary discomfort. This may sound strange at first, but its purpose is very practical. The Stoics would sometimes practice living with less comfort on purpose. They might eat simple food, wear plain clothes, or sleep on a hard surface for a few days. Why would they do this? Because it helped them realize that they could survive without luxury. It reduced their fear of losing comfort. When you know you can handle less, the fear of losing more becomes weaker. In modern life, this could mean small acts like taking cold showers, limiting unnecessary spending, or spending time without digital distractions. These practices build resilience. They teach your mind that discomfort is not the end of the world. Another important Stoic technique is negative visualization, or imagining loss in a calm, controlled way. This is very different from anxious worrying. Instead of imagining disaster in a chaotic, emotional way, the Stoics would calmly think about the possibility of losing something they valued. They might imagine losing their possessions, their status, or even their loved ones, not to make themselves miserable, but to appreciate what they had and to mentally prepare for change. This practice had two benefits. First, it increased gratitude. When you imagine losing something, you become more aware of its value. Second, it reduced fear. When you face a possibility calmly in your mind, it becomes less terrifying instead of an unknown horror. It becomes a situation you have already thought through. The Stoics also placed great importance on daily reflection. At the end of each day, they would review their actions and thoughts. They would ask themselves questions like, what did I do well today? Where did I let fear or anger control me? What can I do better tomorrow? This was not meant to create guilt or self-criticism. It was meant to build awareness. By observing your own patterns, you gain the ability to change them. Over time, this daily reflection helps you notice when imagined suffering begins to take over. You become more aware of the stories your mind tells. And once you are aware, you have the power to choose a different response. Another key Stoic idea is focusing on what is within your control. When you feel overwhelmed, divide the situation into two parts: what you can control and what you cannot. You cannot control the economy. You cannot control other people's opinions. You cannot control the past. You cannot control every outcome. But you can control your effort, your honesty, your discipline, your preparation, your response. When you shift your focus to what you can control, your energy becomes more productive. Instead of worrying endlessly about outcomes, you invest your effort in actions, and action is the antidote to imagined suffering. Fear thrives in stillness. It grows when you sit and think about what might go wrong. But when you begin taking steps, no matter how small, the mind has less room to create imaginary disasters. If you're worried about your finances, create a simple plan. If you're worried about your career, learn one new skill. If you're worried about a relationship, have one honest conversation. Each small action replaces a piece of imagined fear with real progress over time. These practices reshape the mind. You begin to notice your thoughts more clearly. You stop believing every fear automatically. You spend less time in imagined futures and more time in real actions. And slowly, your emotional state changes. You feel lighter, not because life became perfect, but because you stopped carrying unnecessary mental weight. You feel calmer, not because problems disappeared, but because you stopped multiplying them in your imagination. This is the quiet power of the Stoic approach. It doesn't promise a life without difficulty. It promises a mind that is strong enough to face difficulty without adding extra suffering at the end of your life. You may look back and realize something important. Many of the things you feared never happened. Many of the nights you spent worrying were unnecessary. Many of the imagined disasters never became real. But the energy you spent worrying, that was real. The opportunities you avoided, that was real. The time lost to fear, that was real. And that realization can be painful. But you don't have to wait until the end of life to learn this lesson. You can see it now. You can begin to question your fears now. You can start separating reality from imagination today. Because the truth is simple, even if it's not always easy to accept. Much of your unhappiness is not coming from your actual life, that it's coming from the stories your mind keeps telling about it. And the moment you stop believing every one of those stories, you begin to reclaim your peace, your energy, and your future.